Welcome my friends, this is Maniacal Incorporated, and as you've probably guessed by now, I am a big fan of Paradox and their games. So, like a lot of you, I was interested and excited to see the announcement for it's finally real. They've announced Famine Queen 3, the latest in the Famine Queen series, also known as Victoria. And as well as being a fan of Paradox games in general, I'm always interested to see how Paradox goes about representing Ireland in its various historical entries. So what I'm going to do today is take a look at a post that has been made on the brand new, the shiny Victoria 3 subreddit. A post has been put up there by Lena Hafer, who got a look at, I think maybe an early access copy. It looks like there was maybe a demo, a closed demo given to some journalists. And there is a massive post with lots and lots of really interesting information. So what I want to do is I want to look down through this and see how Ireland might be represented in Victoria 3. So we can start at the beginning. The game is going to run from the year 1836 until 1936. Where exactly was Ireland at this point in time? On the 1st of January 1801, the Kingdom of Ireland was dragged kicking and screaming into the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The Parliament in Dublin was shut down and Irish MPs now attended the Imperial Parliament in Westminster. In 1829, legislation was passed allowing Roman Catholics to sit in Westminster, which had dramatic effects in Ireland, where about 85% of the population was Roman Catholic but had been banned from the civil service and had been barred from holding political office up until this point. By 1836, when the game starts, the Royal Irish Constabulary has just been amalgamated together out of a number of independent policing groups in Ireland. They're going to be set up along semi-military lines, and they are going to be used explicitly for enforcing and maintaining British rule on the island of Ireland. We're also coming to the end of what's known as the Tithe War, which started, I think, in 1830 or 31 and lasted until 1836. Again, like I mentioned, Roman Catholics made up the overwhelming majority of the population of the island of Ireland, but the Anglican Church of Ireland was the established church, which meant that everyone, including Roman Catholics, had to pay tithes to maintain the church. And this caused a lot of dissatisfaction, as you can imagine. From 1836 onwards, Roman Catholics still had to pay tithes, but it wasn't enforced, and it wasn't until 1869 that the Church of Ireland was disestablished in Ireland as the state church, or as the established church. And of course, most importantly, in 1836, Ireland is just a decade out from a devastating humanitarian crisis, the Great Hunger, the effects of which are still being felt almost 200 years later. Today, the combined population of the island of Ireland, of the two separate political entities, the Republic of Ireland and the British-controlled Northern Ireland, the population of the island is still less than it was in the early 1840s, just before the Great Hunger took hold. So while Ireland won't be an independent entity in the 1836 start, it will be a very unhappy hostage in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the Great Hunger is going to possibly create events and circumstances and situations which will have ramifications for a number of different countries right down to the end date of the game in 1936. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is represented by Paradox, and certain aspects of the Irish relationship with the United Kingdom and its position within the United Kingdom are going to be difficult to represent, but from what I've seen so far, I'm actually quite hopeful that we're going to get a really accurate and interesting representation of Ireland. We're told that the world is going to be broken up into a number of different states, which are going to be the smallest entities that you will engage in at a political level, those states can be further broken up into provinces. And from what it looks like, there appears to be 4 provinces, or 4 states, I should say. I'm going to get very confused between those two. There are 4 states on the island of Ireland representing the 4 historical provinces. So we can see from some early footage that's been released that Leinster is highlighted. And we can see the cities Belfast, the capital of Ulster. We see in Leinster, Dublin, and then it looks like down in Munster we have the great city of Cork Fixpause. Presumably, Galway is hidden by the bit of UI to the left, but it does look as though there is a slight little black line separating the south of Connacht from the north of Munster, and then again cutting off Sligo from Donegal, way up towards the top. So I think it looks like there's going to be 4 provinces, or 4 states on the island of Ireland, which will be further broken up into smaller provinces, which you won't really interact with. So now we can take a look at the first major point that is going to impact Ireland and its place within the United Kingdom, and that is culture and religion. The first thing to note is that the game is going to individually model over 1 billion people at the start of the game, so we can expect to see on the eve of the Great Hunger about 8 million individually modelled people on the island of Ireland, all with their own separate needs and traits. We're then told that every nation, so the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland for example, every nation has a primary culture and state religion, with varying levels of acceptance for other religions and cultures based on your laws. Non-accepted POPs, so POPs that do not follow the primary culture or the state religion, they're going to be paid lower wages, have lower standards of living, and are more likely to radicalise. And as we've seen already, the overwhelming majority of the population of Ireland did not follow the state religion. We can imagine that the state religion for the United Kingdom is going to be Anglicanism. So Church of England in England, Church of Ireland in Ireland. So that's going to be a cause of tremendous upheaval and tension on the island of Ireland. We also see that there are going to be no cultural groups, but instead that cultures will have traits. And there's 2 examples given here, heritage traits and linguistic traits. And your laws will look at how alike or different these are to your main culture. So we can imagine that whatever the primary culture of the United Kingdom is, it will have as its linguistic trait, most likely, English. Whereas on the island of Ireland, before the Great Hunger, a substantial proportion of the population, especially in Munster and Connacht, will speak Irish. And we'd expect the POPs in these regions to have, as their linguistic trait, the Irish language. Historically, however, the Great Hunger did a number on the Irish-speaking population of the island of Ireland in particular, and by the end of the 1800s, the Irish language was in severe decline. But the people in Ireland, of course, still kept an Irish culture. So it'll be interesting to see how this can be replicated in the game, or if it can be replicated in the game. If an Irish POP can transition from being having, we'll say, the Irish language linguistic trait to having the English language linguistic trait, but remaining as a separate Irish culture group, but again we're told that there are no culture groups. So how is this going to be represented? I imagine it's going to be maybe part of the heritage trait, and of course there are tons and tons of other traits in there that we haven't seen or heard from yet. So it looks like a British ruler starting the game in 1836 is going to have a very dissatisfied Irish population practicing a unaccepted state religion, or a religion outside of the one that is tolerated by the state, and having a culture that is not tolerated by the state or is heavily maligned against. There are actually still in force in Ireland today, in Northern Ireland, Anti-Irish Language Legislation. I think it's the Administration of Justice Act 1737, which, amongst other things, bans the use of the Irish language in the court system. That is still in effect in Northern Ireland. It is the only part of the United Kingdom that legislation is in effect in, and pretty much all it does is prevents you from speaking Irish. You have to speak English. So there would have been many discriminatory laws in place. Maybe you can try and end these, maybe you can try and double down on them. But in previous Paradox games, when you are dealing with a large population that does not approve of what you're selling, generally what you do is press a button, spend some resources, wait for a period of time, and they convert en masse. Historically, looking at the scenario in Ireland over an going on 900-year period, from the Normans to the English to the British, attempts to bring Ireland, or to assimilate Ireland, into the British sphere, or into a British culture, or into the United Kingdom failed utterly. And the 120-year period in which Ireland was part of the United Kingdom in its totality was one of constant violence and upheaval on the island of Ireland. So it'll be interesting to see if that can be replicated through the systems that have been put in place here. I have a hope that they can. I think they can. There's a couple of things that I can see kind of blocking it. But yeah, that's going to be really interesting. I'm really interested to see how this primary culture and state religion works out in relation to Ireland. Okay, another mechanic I want to look at very briefly is prices of goods. We're told that prices of goods are based on supply and demand. So the more goods, the more of a specific type of good that are produced, the lower its price will be. The less that's produced, the higher its price will be, on the condition that there's actually a demand. But we're also told that another factor that affects prices is infrastructure. Having insufficient infrastructure will make it harder to get goods from a given state to your wider market efficiently. We're also told that there exists services and that these are a non-tradable good, so they can't leave the market. And again, access to services is based on infrastructure. These appear to be generated from buildings called urban centres, which can't be directly built but are generated automatically based on the urbanisation of your states. And the reason that I want to focus on infrastructure is because if we go back to that map of the British and Irish Isles of the United Kingdom, we can see that there appears to be close to no infrastructure whatsoever in Ireland. If we look over at the states in England in particular, actually exclusively in England, there's one train heading from Birmingham to Cardiff. I don't think there are any trains up around Scotland. Instead, it is England that is heavily infrastructuralized. Is that a word? We can see lots and lots of trains running between practically every city. And then if we come over to poor old Ireland, we can see that there's a couple of roads. There's one from Dublin heading away off to Sligo. Doesn't appear as though there's any roads leading into Belfast or into Ulster whatsoever. Cork Fitzpaws has a couple of roads coming off of it, but we don't see any trains. Now, historically, Ireland would have had a fairly well-built up train infrastructure because the British needed to get their soldiers around the country in a hurry. Oh boys, did they need to get their soldiers around the country in a hurry. But practically speaking, infrastructure in Ireland was quite lacking. So while there would have been trains in Ireland at this point in time, the fact that if trains are an indication of infrastructure, and if infrastructure is going to be quite low, or if Ireland looks to have quite low infrastructure, that's pretty accurate. It does tell us that the British market of Leinster has infrastructure of 60, and the infrastructure usage is 35. Not too sure what any of that means at the moment. We can also see that even just by appearances, the urban centres on the island of Ireland look much smaller than the urban centres, we'll say, of London or even Birmingham, if you compare Birmingham and Dublin. So very few of these service goods are going to be produced in Ireland. You're predominantly looking at them being produced in Britain, and it's going to be very tough if these need to be put on a boat, however you put services on a boat. get them from one of the ports in England to Dublin, and then get them distributed throughout the rest of the country. So that seems to be pretty accurate, I would say. And it's going to be interesting to see how this infrastructure plays into the game. But yeah, even looking at it now, it's pretty much just England that's infrastructuralized. And poor old Scotland, poor old Ireland, got nothing. The Welsh have a train. They've one train. That's about it. But yeah, that's pretty historically accurate, I'd say. Now, the other thing that we can see on the screen on the right-hand side is the interest groups, which are currently represented in the state of Leinster. Individual POPs are of a type. So some of the types that a POP can be are things like capitalist, labourer, machinist, farmer, and these POP types can then belong to an interest group. We've been told that there are a handful of templates for these interest groups, which differentiate how the same interest group will act in various different countries. And one of the examples is that industrialists in Prussia are very pro-monarchy, whereas in the United States, that's not the case. So example interest groups that the author got to see were things like industrialists, landowners, and again, we were told about that template. They're different, or they're represented differently in different countries. They're Junkers in Prussia, they're landed gentry in Britain. There are also things like the armed forces, rural folk, who I presume will be called culchies in Ireland, the petty bourgeois, or the bourgeoisie. There's trade unions. And this is the interesting one, devout. And again, from country to country, what the devout interest group is called will change, and in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, the devout interest group is called Anglican Church. Now, I don't know exactly what that means. Is there going to be a Roman Catholic interest group? I don't think there will. And how does this Anglican Church gel with the actual religion trait that individual POPs can have? So I'm not too sure how that is going to be impacted. We would presume that in Ireland we would see few enough people being members of the Anglican Church. But these interest groups also have ideologies, which are things that they want, and traits, which are things that they can do. The example given here is of Prussian industrialists. They have the monarchist ideology, so they're very upset if you switch away from the monarchy form of government. They are individualist, so they disapprove of implementing welfare programs, and they are abolitionist. They don't like slavery. So implementing ideologies that they support is going to increase their loyalty, and implementing laws which gel with their ideologies will increase their loyalty, and implementing laws which go against their ideologies, such as declaring a republic and owning slaves, that would make the Prussian industrialist loyalty go down. We're also told that you can suppress or promote interest groups using your authority, which is an administrative capacity stat. We haven't really heard much more about those, but what's really interesting is this idea of legitimacy. Now, another thing that can be done with interest groups is you can bring them into your government. You can invite them to your government. Legitimacy is a mechanic in the game that prevents you from inviting too many of the interest groups into your government. It looks like to implement laws, you need to have the approval of, well, effectively your government. So if you want to implement laws which the military approve of, it's best to have the military in the government to help you get those through, because they're going to vote in favour of them. Also, if you have the military in power, it's going to make it very difficult for you to implement laws which the military does not approve of. And legitimacy then is a measure that prevents you from basically inviting everyone into the government. Very interestingly, you can earn legitimacy from having your leader's interest group in government. So your leader will be a POP. they will be individually modelled within the game. And in the case of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland in 1836, this pop is William of Hanover, who came to power, I think, in 1830 and will die in 1837. His niece, Queen Victoria, will succeed him. I'm sure you've heard of her before. And as you can imagine, as the head of the Anglican Church, most likely he would be a member of the Anglican Church or the devout interest group. So by having the Anglican Church in government, he's going to receive, or you, if you're playing as the United Kingdom, you're going to receive additional legitimacy. It's not really too clear what else legitimacy can be used for, but the example given here by Lena Hafer on the post on Reddit is that as Prussia, they had to have the armed forces in the government because they were the king's faction, or they would take a hit to legitimacy, and that in turn made it very hard to pass laws that the military didn't approve of. So you can imagine, if you take on the role of the United Kingdom, you're William of Hanover, the head of the Anglican Church, you have the Anglican Church in your government, and you need to implement laws which the Anglican Church might not approve of to try and get the Irish to stop rebelling so much. We're beginning to see some of the mechanics that prevented anything from being done to sort out the dissatisfaction that the Irish people felt throughout the 1800s. There were very powerful vested interests at play in Britain, and they did not want to see solutions to the problems in Ireland. You can imagine if the landed gentry are one of the interest groups that are in your government. Towards the end of the 1800s, the breakup of the estates of the Protestant ascendancy, the landed aristocracy, breaking up these estates and selling the land to the impoverished Irish, and this was achieved through loaning money to them. Maybe the landed gentry would object to this. Maybe there might be you might be dependent on the landed gentry to form a government that implements some of your policies. There's rebellion being threatened in Ireland. You want to implement some policies in Ireland to try and keep them happy, but to get other policies through, you need to favour what the landed gentry want. So that's, like I said, it looks like we have the potential for simulating a lot of the tension that existed in Ireland throughout the 1800s. So it'll be really interesting to see how it's actually implemented. But I really do like the system. A lot of people are quite unhappy at the moment that political parties seem to be gone. There don't seem to be any political parties in the game. Instead, governments are formed from these interest groups. My only problem is that the game mightn't be able to simulate the way that Ireland was, in effect, governed as a completely separate entity to the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, what I mean here is that even though Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, it was governed effectively as a colony. Ireland had a Lord Lieutenant who represented the King, and it also had a Chief Secretary and Under Secretary who ran the Irish government from Dublin Castle, and they were appointed directly by the Cabinet in Westminster. The Lord Lieutenant is an interesting one because the King was resident in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, which meant the King was resident in Ireland, which means he didn't need somebody to represent him. But the Lord Lieutenant, by representing, i.e. usurping the powers of the King within the United Kingdom, was technically, legally, committing treason. But of course this was never looked at in any serious way because of course Ireland was in effect governed as a colony. And the problem here is that from the example we can see that as well as the Anglican Church, the rural folk, which to me sounds like something out of Game of Thrones, the rural folk are crossing the wall and they won't clean their Wellingtons, they've it destroyed. There's muck all over it. The rural folk are also in government, and you can imagine that if Ireland is made up of a large section of Farmers, if a lot of the pop types in Ireland are farmers, they would be very happy with the implementation of any rural folk ideologies. Any laws which suit the rural folk ideologies. But the reality, of course, is that the British would implement laws in Ireland to the detriment of the Irish people, laws which were not implemented throughout the rest of the United Kingdom. There were, we'll say in 1829, when the laws were introduced that finally allowed Roman Catholics to sit in Parliament, also just for Ireland, a special little present for Ireland, they drove up the amount of land that you needed to own to be entitled to vote. So basically they disenfranchised a large section of the population in the hopes that this would disenfranchise predominantly Roman Catholic voters. And they were able to do this. They were able to target and isolate parts of the United Kingdom and implement laws there just for the Irish or just for the Scottish or just for the Welsh. So in this game, if we see laws coming in that benefit the rural folk, we would imagine that would keep the Irish happy, but the reality is that historically, laws which were implemented in Britain very rarely came into effect in Ireland in any positive way. So that's something that might hinder the accurate representation of the tensions that existed in Ireland throughout the 1800s. Now, the last major point to focus on in interest groups is radicals and loyalists. We're told that falling standards of living can generate radical pops, while rising standards of living can convert those radicals to neutrals or neutrals to loyalists. Having more radicals in a state generates turmoil, which can affect the economy and lead to uprisings, and having more radicals in an interest group will lower the group's approval towards the current government, while loyalists in an interest group will do the opposite, and this can lead to civil war or revolution. And we can also see that cultural discrimination can generate radicals. So we can imagine that as a British ruler, or as the ruler of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, introducing laws which might discriminate culturally against pops with the Irish linguistic trait, that's going to lead to radicalisation. And of course, because all of these pops are being modelled individually, they have lifespans. They can die off. So loyalist pops, and as well as radicals, can die off, and this can create intergenerational conflict. If you had an era of prosperity that generated a lot of loyalists and then they die, the younger generation with worse economic opportunities might suddenly be not so happy and change the loyalty and attitude of your interest groups. And this is pretty much what happens on the eve of the War of Independence between 1919 and 1921. You have a generation of young men and women who have very little opportunity other than to emigrate. And on the outbreak of the First World War, immigration is blocked. If you want a job, the British Army will take you. Very early on, however, the Vatican comes out, doesn't explicitly denounce the war, but the Vatican comes out against the First World War, and the Roman Catholic hierarchy in Ireland comes out against the war. So those who are intent on fighting, those who support Britain, who support the war, and those who are desperate for work, they join the British Army in the earliest days, in late 1914, early 1915, and from there on, Irish recruits to the British Army drops off a cliff edge. The British consider implementing conscription on numerous occasions. That leads to severe political upheaval in 1918, and many of the people who have been blocked from leaving the country are radicalised and play a major role in the War of Independence. So that's a really interesting dynamic, that you can have intergenerational conflict like this. You need to kind of plan for the future, and I do like scenarios where you implement policies in a desperate bid to achieve something now, and you push the problems down the line. Quite often, you don't have structures which punish you in future. But this does look like you could implement policies now, but there's going to be cuts in the future, and when those cuts come, there's going to be hell to pay. So I'm really looking forward to that. That has a lot of interesting implications, not alone for Ireland, but for much of the gameplay in Victoria 3. And the very last point on radicals is that you can fund police institutions to reduce the local effects of radicals. You can also bring up the standard of living, or change discriminating laws to de-radicalize them, or you can just discriminate even harder and hope they go away. So the modern British Secret Service is effectively established initially, day one, to monitor the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And of course, like I said, the RIC was amalgamated in 1836 and established on semi-military lines. So this is very fitting as well. And it's to be expected, and it's used all around the world where police institutions are used to monitor and deter and persecute radicals, which just makes things worse. And it only makes sense that I would leave to the very end a discussion on migration. We're told that there's going to be trickle migration, and that this will mostly happen within cultural regions, to and from colonies, and within your own market. And the example that's given is of a Germanic cultured pop. And they will be free to move around the Germanic home region, between your metropole and your colonies, or to anywhere in their home country's market. Pops won't just trickle migrate wherever at all times. The exception to this is migration waves, and these are caused by poor economic conditions, political unrest, ethnic discrimination, etc., etc. These will be major events rather than a trickle, i.e., that stands for Ireland. Famine in Ireland might trigger a migration wave from Ireland to the United States. People engaged in a migration wave will try to target countries that have better standards of living and freer laws than the place they're leaving, but it's not explicitly tied to New World or Old World, or versus Old World like in Vicky 2. So what we're seeing here is that you might have the Great Hunger in Ireland. This is the example that's given, and you're going to see a flood of people, a migration wave, abandoning the country and going to somewhere like the United States. There's a number of different factors which will attract the people in any particular region. What I'm interested in here is, first of all, how will this migration wave be treated in the country that it arrives in? We've already seen that there's going to be accepted culture and religion groups. There's going to be laws determining how people are treated. So Irish-speaking Roman Catholic pops arriving in the United States, they're going to be discriminated against, as happened historically. But can they become Irish American? Are they just going to be assimilated into the main culture over time, or can they form their own, effectively, their own distinctive culture? And maybe that's within, like we've already seen, these culture traits. Maybe a few of them will get switched one way and the other, and creates what is effectively a proxy for Irish Americans. Once the initial migration wave, let's say that all the Irish go to America, after the Great Hunger, after this initial migration wave, will we then see trickle migration of Irish from Ireland drawn to the United States? Will this big Irish migration wave to the United States act like a magnet? Because of course what happened historically is that the Irish who went to America in the as a result of the famine, they laid the groundwork for the later Irish that travelled over. They would write letters home. They would tell the families, start teaching the younger siblings English. They're going to need English in the United States. Irish society and the education system is basically geared for the next 100 and something years towards immigration, specifically to the United States. So are we going to see that replicated somehow? And the other thing is, how is this big migration wave? And I'm just talking about Ireland here, but this could apply to any country that suffers poor economic conditions, political unrest, or ethnic discrimination. Will this big Irish population in the United States, will that have an impact on affairs in the United States and in the country it left going forward? So we have this big migration wave from Ireland in the 1840s, and then fast forward to, well, first of all, the American Civil War. A lot of Irish-born men would have taken part in the American Civil War, predominantly on the Union side, but there were a few on the Confederate side as well. Those in the Union Army would have gotten together and invaded Canada in the aftermath of the American Civil War, hoping to conquer Canada and hold it to ransom, hold it hostage in demand for Ireland's liberation. Then they started financing bombing campaigns in London. There was an attempt to bomb I think it was London Bridge, and was it Pentonville Prison? They blew in the wall of a prison at one stage as well. Then, if we come into the early 1900s, the Irish Americans are in contact with the German government. They set up contacts between Roger Casement and the Imperial German government at the start of the First World War. They collect funds for the 1916 Rising. Eamon de Valera, born in New York to an Irish mother. He's sent home to Ireland when he's about 2.5 years of age. He travels back to New York, back to America, when he has become president of Sinn Féin and president of the Dáil Éireann, and he collects about $5 million between 1919 and 1920. So the diaspora that is set up in the United States, that attracts people in the decades and centuries afterwards, continues right down to this very day to have dramatic implications and ramifications for Irish and British foreign policy. Britain is finding itself cornered in its Brexit negotiations, its post-Brexit negotiations, by Irish Americans in power in America insisting that the Good Friday Agreement be adhered to. So, even though the game ends in 1936, are we going to see a migration wave from any country to any other country? Are we going to see that migration wave impacting the country that it's left? And of course, the Irish Americans also, in conjunction with the German Americans, effectively hand the 1920 presidential election to the Republican Party. The Irish Americans are unhappy that Woodrow Wilson is not living up to his promises of self-determination for small nations and applying that to Ireland. So Irish voters who would have been expected to vote Democrat, they don't turn out. So you see the Republican Party winning, and Irish Americans also had a significant role in having America not join the League of Nations. So this migration wave has dramatic consequences for decades, centuries. Will that be replicated in Vicky 3, or will these migration waves just be absorbed into the main culture and the main religion of the country pretty quickly? Now, there are a few other things which could potentially concern Ireland or impact Ireland, or that Ireland could have an impact on. But I'm going to leave it there and leave those to be discussed maybe at a later point in time when we get some more info. There are two very short things that I do want to address, however. If a revolution happens, you can side with the rebels. So you can be super duper capitalist on purpose, make life hell for all the workers, then switch sides when the socialists rise up. Now that's a revolution. I wonder if you could be super duper discriminatory to the Irish, make life hell for them, and then switch sides when they rise up. You could more than likely just, if you desperately wanted to play an Ireland game, you could just release Ireland, presumably as a puppet, or grant it independence. Maybe you could start the game as France and straight off invade to make Ireland independent, but there's also a possibility that you could actually side with Irish nationalist rebels, and nationalism is one word that I did not see mentioned anywhere throughout this subreddit post. There's a link to it below in the description. It's fantastic. It's amazing the amount of work that was put into writing it. So there's no mention of nationalism so far, which would have been pretty big in the 1800s. But yeah, that leaves open the possibility that you could play as Irish rebels. Change history in 1848. So there was a rebellion in 1848, another in 1867. You could attempt to create one of these revolutions again, and this time see it through to the end. And the final point is, at the very end, historical events. The Civil War is, the US Civil War here is given as an example. Historical events can happen, but only if the correct conditions exist. If the US player plays the interest group game really well and manages to abolish slavery peacefully in the 1840s, there won't be a hard-coded Civil War event chain that fires. So, we've already seen mention of the Great Hunger. It was used as an example for a migration wave. Does that indicate that if the British player doesn't get the economic conditions in Ireland under control fast enough from the get-go, that you could have, or that you will have, the Great Hunger trigger in the mid-1840s. The other possibilities then, like I said, you could see rebellions, an 1848 rebellion, 1867 rebellion, possibly the land wars in Ireland, if the conditions are right. If a global war breaks out maybe in the early 1900s, could you see Irish Republican Brotherhood revolutionaries gaining support from the Germans or from some other entity? So lots of really, really interesting possibilities there for historical events concerning Ireland. And like I said, Ireland isn't going to be an independent entity in this game, but lots and lots and lots of really interesting events that could make life hell for a player trying to maintain British control over Ireland. So there you go. A lengthy first look at what we know of the game so far and how some of the structures that we see emerging might impact the representation of Ireland in the game. I don't want to see an Ireland that just gets absorbed and loses its culture and its language and any defining traits in 1837. Like I said, centuries of British and English and Norman rule were incapable of achieving that, and it feels wrong when you're able to do that in maybe Europa Universalis or a couple of other games. Just press a button and the Irish are gone. They're just accommodated happily into the British Empire. I also don't want to see a game where it's impossible to see the problems of the island of Ireland dealt with successfully. But I do want to see it kind of handled in a historically accurate way, because I think it would be fun to recreate the conditions of the time, fun on the eve of the Great Hunger. Yeah, it would be interesting. I've used that word a lot. It would be interesting to recreate the conditions of the time period and to see how they would have played out under varying different circumstances. I'm going to follow the development of Vicky 3, but I'm not going to be making very many videos like this unless there are maybe devlogs that impact on the representation of Ireland or how Ireland might be represented in Victoria 3. I'm sure others will be doing full-length analyses of the devlogs, and I'll be following those with interest. However, if you are looking for videos on the representation of Ireland in other Paradox games or other games in general, I'll be putting out more of those in the future, and I will of course be returning to see how Ireland is represented in the final Victoria 3 product when it is released, and then when about 20 DLC are released after it. Thank you for joining me on this episode. I hope you found it interesting. Tell me below in the comment section what you have seen or heard in this video today that excites you the most about Victoria 3 and about how Ireland might be represented in it. Is there anything that frightens you? Is there anything that makes you think, oh no, Ireland isn't going to look good. Ireland is just going to be made to look like a happy, satisfied part of Britain? And what historical events from the period 1836 to 1936 would you like to see represented in Victoria 3? What events from Irish history? What major characters are you looking forward to seeing represented as Pops? We might see Michael Collins or Eamon de Valera as Pops in Victoria 3. Who knows? Thank you very much for joining me on this episode, and I will talk to you again in future.